Now I'm going to talk about the IMF and World Bank stance. And this is the third part of the paper written in the 1990s, State and Civil Society in Nigeria. And I talk there about the beginning of neoliberal structural adjustment program in the country. So on the World Bank and IMF stance, when the decision-making was in process. As recounted above, because of the challenges faced, the Babangida regime had to make some strategic retreats and tactical reroutings in the implementation of specific conditionalities. However, neither the World Bank nor the IMF was satisfied with the pace of the structural adjustment program implementation. Consequently, they utilized carrot and stick tactics to push the regime to keep to the original schedules. For example, due to demands from social forces, the regime was constrained to increase government spending by 37% in the 1988 budget. These funds were to provide SAP relief measures, which included meal subsidies for civil servants, as well as the provision of mass transportation and the creation of the National Directorate of Employment, NDE, and the Open Apprenticeship Program. The budget projected that $3,395 million would be allocated to the foreign exchange market, with $50 million a fortnight reserved for the public sector and $100 million a fortnight for the private sector. So you see my point. A lot of the issues with the foreign exchange and the value of the naira, they began very long ago as public policy issues and problems in need of a solution. And what we're doing today in Nigeria is very much what was being done in the 1980s and 1990s. So the multilaterals and Nigeria's external creditors considered the reflationary tendencies of the 1988 budget a departure from their expectations. This is not what they wanted Nigeria to do. So the World Bank opposed the Babangida regime's spending on development projects, particularly the Ajaokuta steel plant. Consequently, the bank withheld a $500 million trade and investment policy loan, which was to have been a source of funding for the foreign exchange market. As was the case with the oil subsidy removal, pressure from the World Bank and IMF forced the government to use extreme measures to impose the conditionalities on the people. Now, that's just a small slice. I'll go directly to my conclusion. In 1990, the World Bank's evaluation of SAP in Nigeria read in part as follows, and I quote, "Significant progress has been made, though there is still a long way to go. The real exchange rate has undergone substantial depreciation and has been maintained at the depreciated level over a 3-year period. Import licensing has been abolished. Freedom in pricing and marketing arrangements for agricultural produce has led to a revival of non-oil exports. A start has been made in privatizing and commercializing public enterprises. The public expenditure program, now much smaller than in the early 1980s, has been rationalized. Clear-cut policy statements and/or action programs have been adopted for a large number of sectors, including agriculture, industry, population, health, education, and the environment. The foregoing statement implies that by August 1993, SAP had been successfully implemented in Nigeria, thereby suggesting that the state does indeed have dominant power over the people. It also suggests that the hegemonic project by the creditors and multilaterals was successful. However, more careful examination of the Nigerian situation reveals a different scenario. It is noteworthy, for instance, that the removal of the petroleum subsidy, which was supposed to have been completed within 3 years, was still being tackled unsuccessfully a full decade later. In addition, the difficulty with which the government imposed SAP also suggests that the people not only have a will of their own, but that they have some power in exerting it. Nevertheless, some semblance of SAP was implemented in Nigeria. The implementation of the SAP had the following results. One, it was damaging to state sovereignty because the policy that was made from Washington, from the multilateral institutions, the IMF, and the World Bank. There was also the fact that social cohesiveness was damaged, and the material well-being of majority of Nigerians was negatively impacted. State sovereignty was eroded due to 4 factors. First was its loss of autonomy in policymaking and the domination of external forces, as I said before, over the process of determining state goals and objectives. Second was the active involvement of technocrats from both the World Bank and IMF in the policy implementation process, in both monitoring and keeping the Babangida regime faithful to the spirit and letter of SAP. Third was the subordination of the domestic social contract to the payment and servicing of external debts. And fourth was the lack of a consciously and independently determined and articulated national interest. Social cohesiveness was eroded because several social problems intensified and proliferated in the era of SAP. This included religious and ethnic conflicts, and those we still have today with us. These religious and ethnic conflicts arose out of the struggle for scarce resources. There was also an increase in crime. Today, we have not only the kinds of crime that were being done in the 80s and 90s, we have banditry, kidnappings, abduction for money. that is so rampant that many people are actually saying that this has become a niche economy, a kidnap economy. We also had, in that time, increase in armed robbery and drug trafficking. And these avenues, these illicit avenues and criminal avenues of making money became the new avenue to instant prosperity. There was also drastic decline in the standards of living and increased polarization of society into the few wealthy, the shrinking numbers of the middle classes, and rapidly increasing ranks of the impoverished. Today, according to the National Bureau of Statistics in Nigeria, there is the shocking number of 133 million multidimensionally poor people in Nigeria, which has moved some people to dub Nigeria as the poverty capital of the world, to the chagrin of people who are saying, well, you know, yes, it's a good number of poor people, but we're not the poverty capital. I leave you to decide where you would categorize Nigeria. Also, social services at the time were eroded to the point of non-existence. Today, social services are seen as some kind of largesse that the federal government is giving, and people talk about palliatives, you know. I don't like that term, palliatives, because palliatives in the medical sense is treatment that you give to people who are at the doors of death in order to make them comfortably, you know, maybe pain-free or less pain-free as they look and stare death in the eyes. Death is coming, whether or not they are treated. So they are made as comfortable as possible. That's what palliatives are. So Nigerians need to dispense of this term and find a more reasonable alternative. But maybe palliatives is right, because what is being done in terms of the social spending is like putting plaster or Band-Aid on a cancer. It's not going to treat the disease, and the people and the afflicted are going to die, because this is, you know, just radically insufficient. And at the same time, the country is spending so much money on things that are absolutely irrational and unnecessary. For example, those SUVs, one for each member of the legislature. For example, huge bills for travel for our elected officials, including the president, at a time when the country is really suffering drastically. And we're asking for Nigerians to make a sacrifice. My point in saying this is that there is a history to this kind of behavior. And you see it very clearly in what was happening in the 1980s and the 1990s. And I dare say that neoliberalism, as exemplified by SAP, is what made these things legitimate. So, in consequence, many diseases which had been under control in the pre-SAP period wreaked havoc on society. Secondly, the educational system was besieged by problems arising from lack of funding and the after effects of the struggle by students and the intelligentsia against the state for an improved educational system. I think we'll also find relevance from this to the present. Look at the state of our universities. The decline began with neoliberal policies, and they are escalating. And because of the aversion of the state to the critiques that were coming from these sectors, they were very happy to embrace the World Bank advice that tertiary education was a luxury in the situation that Nigeria was. That the IMF was saying that everything has a price and market forces should be allowed to determine access to social services, including education. And there was also the pushing of, okay, if you're going to go beyond primary school, which they said we should spend on, you should embrace what people are now calling TVET, technical, I think, vocational education. So what happened at the time was that demonstrations and strikes were frequent, and the tertiary institutions, in consequence, were closed more often than they were open. So when ASUU, the academic union of the universities, when they go on strike, this thing began in the 1980s and the 1990s as a protest against the terrible decision to withdraw state subsidy from education. So both the economic crisis that preceded it and the solution endorsed by the World Bank and IMF, and which was the SAP, Structural Adjustment Program, both of those things did considerable violence to the social fabric in Nigeria. The standard and quality of life of the majority of Nigerians deteriorated with the fall in the value of the naira. And I think this would resonate with everybody that is struggling now, given the precipitous fall in the value of the naira. The naira today is 1,200 naira to just $1. Contrary to projections that SAP would benefit rural dwellers, the devaluation of the naira increased the prices they had to pay for goods and services, thus whittling any increase in the income of even commodity farmers into almost nothing. The speculative activities of merchants who used commodity exports as a means of facilitating capital flight initially drove up the prices of some agricultural exports, such as cocoa. But by 1989, the cocoa market slumped. And this caused the incomes of cocoa farmers to diminish precipitously. Many committed suicide. The consumption of food, health, and social services declined due to the inability of majority of Nigerians to afford these necessities. The level of social volatility was such that frequent mass demonstrations were sparked off to protest SAP policies. Many lives were lost due to the state's indiscriminate use of force against these protesters. You can see such indiscriminate use of force being leveled at the EndSARS protesters 3 years ago, because they were protesting about what they dubbed bad governance. They were demanding good governance. They were asking for the state not to allow its officials to use indiscriminate force against the youth. They were asking for a non-predatory behavior of state to society. So we see also at that time a high level of volatility in Nigerian state-society relations. Now, when people discuss policy making and implementation under conditions of economic crisis, there are so many examples of these discussions among scholars, but they often assume that actors in economic policy making and implementation are rational maximizers, or that they should be rational maximizers. That is, they consider the costs and benefits of every policy option and they pick the best. It's also sometimes assumed that state inability to either make or implement policies is due to rent-seeking behavior. These assumptions lead to conclusions that I think obfuscate more than they clarify. That is, they're not really clarifying, they're just kind of playing in the shadows. When powerful groups within an indebted country resist the implementation of neoliberal economic policies like SAP in debates over economic policy, their action is also often dismissed as irrational or rent-seeking behavior. It is more fruitful, I think, to consider these instances as episodes in the writing of a constantly evolving transition to democracy. And I dare say, we are still in transition in Nigeria. Our democracy is very young. Civil society during this period either challenges and confronts a still authoritarian state, or it becomes a pawn in the power game of ensuring a managed transition where voting does not amount to choosing. And the limited openings into the political arena is policed by a state that justifies its actions by claiming the importance of political order and economic survival. This dynamic interplay of economic, political, and social forces continues up to the present. I said at the time, and that was April 1999 when I wrote this paper. However, I want to extend it and say it continues up until now, which is 2023. And at the time, the military regime of General Abdul Salami Abubakar had taken over after the sudden death of General Sani Abacha, reputed to be the most brutal dictator that Nigeria ever had, and also the most kleptocratic up until that time because of the massive amounts of money that were stolen. Now, the Abacha loot, as it is called, some of it has been returned to Nigeria, but I don't think all of it has been returned. Plus, looting has become the modus operandi of the custodians of the Nigerian state. And Nigeria is now in dire straits as a result of massive kleptocracy. As living conditions in the 1990s continued to plunge down into hitherto unimagined depths, and smoldering domestic resentment was held in check by the expectation that the ushering in of a new elected government would bring about a combination of political and economic stability. Autonomous associations were thriving. Some of them opposed the government's political transition as not genuinely democratic. I think Nigerians need to do some soul searching. Have we had genuinely democratic elections in our country, even now? And then the other people who were, the other autonomous associations were saying that the government should be engaged in discussions, but what they were looking for were direct benefits to their own membership. That is, they were only concerned about their own narrow interests, what they would gain from the said negotiations. The attempts by the multilateral organizations, the IMF and the World Bank, the Paris Club and the London Club, which are the creditor coalition, to impose their hegemonic agenda on the Nigerian state cannot be described as an unqualified success. At the time, I said, Nigeria had still not become as integrated into the world economy as the multilaterals would wish. It still is not. It is also clear that the Nigerian state has not successfully established its hegemony over the groups in civil society, which take an oppositional stance towards it. While it is certain that the impact of SAP, I said in 1999, will be felt in Nigeria's history for a long time to come, it also seems certain that there will be a diffusion of opposition to the government's economic policies at the inaugural stage of governance by a democratically elected government. If the economy does not improve appreciably, I said, the groups in civil society that will challenge the state are already in existence. So this paper began with an excerpt from an interview of Senator Abraham Adesanya, who was asked by a journalist, quote, "What is your vision of Nigeria in the next millennium?" And we're in that millennium. We're in the second decade of the millennium now. At the time, the senator's reply that he dreams of a Nigeria where no one is oppressed, a country that is egalitarian, where all peoples can freely exercise the right to self-determination, where there is fairness, impartiality, and the rule of law, where the legacy that the present generations leave for future Nigerians is that of freedom and equality in all respects. The claims that were being made by organized civil society in Nigeria in the 1990s are essentially reflected in this statement. And I dare say the claims that were being made by the EndSARS protesters also are reflected in this statement. The demand that people participate in the making of decisions that will impact not only on them and on their well-being, and also negatively impact on their material interests, is not a frivolous demand. It is a claim by people against the state that question what the appropriate role of the state ought to be in the realization of economic and political development. It is a claim that remains relevant today, as Nigeria seems to be on the verge, I said in 1999, in 1999, of concluding its latest foray into political transitional politics. The economy is relevant, and so is politics. And democracy is about the people, all of the people, not just a narrow section of elites that are living high on the hog, while the majority are suffering tremendously. However, in the dialectics between economics and politics, I said in 1999, to decide to sacrifice people at the altar of a fine program of economic recovery is to allow the social fabric to be torn apart. I think that is still relevant today. Nigerians are suffering. Nigeria is still in the throes of the crisis that was set in motion, I said in 1999, and I dare say it still applies today, as a result of the decision to experiment with policies that were devised for other economies in other lands. Having a strong civil society is a necessary bulwark against the misuse of state power. In this respect, both states and civil society in Nigeria are works in progress. Again, this applies today. Thank you very much.